But rather than do this, rather than going through this very nice menu, let's actually dig deeper into the commands that are actually being run on this machine to create the environment, to create the machine that we want to build. Let me start by clearing the screen here, and I'm going to run through a whole list of commands so you can take a look at what's actually going on behind the scenes as you're working through that sconfig menu. Let's start first by recognizing that indeed we aren't actually in PowerShell yet. We are still in the legacy command prompt that we're used to working with other versions of this operating system. And so to start out, let's launch PowerShell so we get all the flexibility of those PowerShell commandlets. Let us now walk through the long list of tasks that we need to in order to get this machine up and on the network, starting with setting its display resolution. The command here is set display resolution. And this command has two parameters we need to enter in, the horizontal and the vertical display resolution that we need, 1280 and then 720 in our case here. For this instance here inside of VMware Workstation, I don't actually think this command works. But in other environments where you have actually a physical machine or where you have the necessary drivers, this command will actually then end up going about setting the display resolution appropriately. Our next task is to go through setting up the time and date and also the time zone here on this machine. Let's start first with the time zone. Let me bring back my cursor here, and we can go to set time zone, and then set the appropriate time zone that we're looking for. In our case being Mountain Standard Time. That's my time zone here. That will set the time zone here on this computer. You may be asking then, well, actually, how do I get the correct verbiage for which time zone I need? The command you'd use for that is /L in order to get a list then of all the different time zones that you could potentially enter in here for configuring the time zone on this computer. So all of these you see here on the screen are options. Once we've set the time zone, our next task is to actually set the date and time itself. So let's do set date, for example, with the date being, let's see, 10/19/2016 at 11:53 a.m., which is right now. That should set our date and time here for this computer to exactly what we've configured here. Next up is actually configuring the IP address on this machine, which requires a couple of different commands we need to take a look at. One such one we'll want to take a look at is get net IP address. Get net IP address then without any parameters will give us a long list of IP addresses and also the interfaces and interface indices that we have here on this computer. Now this includes all of the other indices that are used for things like loopback, as you can see here. There's the IPv4 and IPv6 interfaces as well. And so what we're really looking for are the actual interfaces that correspond with physical network cards for which we can adjust, for example, the IPv4 address for this computer. This, as you can see right here, is its IPv6 address for the interface alias Ethernet 0. And up just a bit, or maybe even down just a bit, we should see right here that 169.254 net address that is the IPv4, the automatic private IP address that's been configured during the initial installation. Let us actually then tailor our query just a bit to take a look at just the interface aliases that correspond with Ethernet 0. So get net IP address then with interface alias right here, Ethernet 0. This is the physical alias. Right here again, this gives us all the information that we require. We need to change this IP address to our 3-net address where this machine currently resides. Let us go ahead and change that IP address now. We'll do that with new net IP address, and then interface alias Ethernet 0. Then the IP address we want to set it to is 192.168.3.110. When we do that, we also have other configurations to configure as well, like for the prefix length, exactly what our subnet mask should be for this computer. We're using a 255.255.255.0 subnet mask, which corresponds to a prefix length of 24. We can also set the default gateway as well, which would be 192.168.3.2 here for the network that I'm working with in this environment. Yours may be slightly different. This will set this up so that we can now configure this new IP address, as you see right here, on the 3-net for our demo environment. You should be aware that in fact you're interested not in setting a physical IP address, but rather a DHCP configuration. The commandlet will be just a little bit different than the earlier one. It is set net IP interface, then with the interface alias equal to Ethernet 0, and then we'll set that up to DHCP and then enable. So this would actually enable DHCP as opposed to setting up that hard IP address that we configured just a second ago. This obviously does not complete our configuration because we also have to set up the connection there to our DNS server. For that, let's take a look then at get net IP configuration there for the interface alias Ethernet 0. There, if we take a look at the different net IP configurations, you can see our DNS server configuration down here, which is currently set to the default. We will need to reset that to our DNS server that exists here in this environment, which you have not built just yet. This DNS server for this environment is going to be 192.168.3.10. Again, we'll be building that here in just a second as we get further along into the DSC configuration. Let's go ahead and use yet another command here to set up the DNS client server address that we require. That will be set DNS client server address there, with the interface alias again being Ethernet 0. Then the server address here being the server address that we want to point ourselves towards for that DNS server. We only have a single DNS server, or will only have a single DNS server after we get through that further configuration, which will be 192.168.3.10. If you have multiple DNS servers, you would separate them here by commas, but this configuration sets us up to that single DNS server that we will actually have configured here in just a second. If we take one more look here, you can see that our DNS server 3.10 is now configured here for this computer. We still have more work to do, not the least of which being the changing of the host name for this computer. Let me show you here that if I run the hostname command, or not the hostname command, the hostname command, our hostname is that randomized name that's created as we go through the initial installation of Windows Server. And in fact, hostname itself is a legacy command prompt tool. If you want to be fully PowerShell about how you actually gather this information, a slightly more geeky way of gathering the same information is through the get content command by taking a look at the the computer name environment information, the computer name environment variable here, which is essentially the same thing, but that's the more PowerShell way to get to the same result. Once you've got that information, once you know what you want to name this computer, our next command here is actually rename computer. And if we take a look here at rename computer, we will choose new name as being server 1, and then also to restart the computer once this is complete. This will go about actually changing the name here on the computer. It is still in a work group, and rebooting the machine. Let me pause things here really quickly. When we come back, we'll continue this configuration. And then fast forwarding things to the other end of the reboot, we've got some more tasks to complete, which next up is the entering in of our license information for this computer. Curiously, the licensing or the entering in of license information still uses an old school VBS file, a VBS script more or less, to enter in all the license information and complete the activation. slmgr.vbs is that command you'll want to enter in. And if I show you the /? here, there are actually just a couple, at least at this point in time, that we need to pay attention to. The first of these is install product key or /IPK. This is the parameter you'll use for actually entering in the characters that make up that license key for this machine. The second I just want to point your attention towards is /ATO for activating Windows. Now there are an entirely much longer list of possible parameters that exist here with slmgr, which take up 5 different screens of text, as we see all these here in the Windows script host box. But for our purposes here, slmgr-IPK and -ATO are the two you'll need to do for entering in your appropriate license key. Our next task then after that is to go through making sure that the firewall is correctly configured here on this machine. And if I clear the screen once more, I want to show you a couple of commandlets that you should be prepared for. The get net firewall rule command is the first of these, which if we take a look at it initially, you'll see presents an entire list of information here that's a bit hard to parse. Let us now pipe that into format tables so that we can just see which of the rules are currently on this machine. These rules are the ones that exist over here in the left column, and over here on the right, if we scroll up, are going to be the actual display names for these rules. So what we see there in the interface and then what we need to address them as over here on the left. If we wanted to, for example, take a look at some of the firewall rules that are out there, let's say that we want to enable the ping command to function going inbound and outbound of this machine. We know that ping is handled through the firewall rule called corenet IGMP-in and -out. Let me show you that here with get net firewall rule, and then with the name being corenet-IGMP-in. There's the rule we're looking for. There is a similar rule, so this is the inbound rule. There's a similar rule there for the outbound as well. And if we take these two rules here and pipe them into enable net firewall rule, that will actually go about enabling these firewall rules one at a time. So there's the inbound rule, and then now if I scroll over, we can do the outbound rule. That now enables the abilities for ping commands to work inbound and outbound from this machine. But actually going through onesie-twosie and figuring out what these firewall exclusions should be can be a bit challenging when you have to address them here at the command line. Microsoft actually consolidates multiple firewall rules together into what are called display groups. And if we take a look here at the net firewall rule again, and then actually pipe this down so we can take a look at the display names and then the display groups, we can then see which firewall rules correspond with which groups. Or actually we could if we could see over here on the right, because they're kind of off the screen because of how I've zoomed this in. Let's actually just take a look at this, just the groups themselves. And we'll assume then that there are indeed firewall rules in each of these groups. These are the display groups, as you can see over here. Windows Firewall Remote Management, WMI, Remote Service Management, the core networking group right here, performance logs and alerts, and so on. Let's say, for example, that we're interested in enabling file and printer sharing, and then all the individual firewall rules that correspond with file and printer sharing. We can, back over here, if I clear the screen once again, then enable the firewall rule that corresponds just with that display group, and then all the firewall rules included within that group. Let's do enable net firewall rule, and then the display group being file and printer sharing. That now enables all those individual firewall rules that exist there in the group. Now, for our purposes here, and again, this is something you would never do in production, but for our purposes here in this lab environment, let's actually take the firewall out of the way so that we don't have to worry about whether or not our demonstrations are working because of firewall rules. Let's say, for example, that we want to also create a brand new rule that does not exist already in the list that Microsoft provides. This gives us the abilities to see exactly how these new rules are created, as well as opening up the firewall to get it out of the way for our future demonstrations. Let me create a new net firewall rule here, with the display name being allow all traffic. Then for that, for the direction outbound, let's go ahead and create the action of allow. This should go about allowing all traffic and enabling this rule so that all outbound traffic is allowed through the firewall. We are not disabling the firewall. We're just creating a rule that allows all the traffic to go out without being blocked. Let us also create the reverse firewall rule here for the inbound traffic. There is our direction inbound, which does the same thing except for traffic coming in. So this frees us now to complete these other demonstrations without having to worry about that firewall getting in the way. Again, you don't do this in production, but for our purposes here in just learning, this simplifies that whole process of figuring out all these new technologies. And then with these firewall rules now configured, we have the last task we need to accomplish, which is actually getting this machine into the domain. Again, we don't yet have the domain, so you'll need to accomplish this after we get through a little bit further along here in this course. But recognize that the command that you're looking for is add computer, with the domain name being then company.pri, and then restart to restart the machine. If everything works correctly here, we should then be able to enter in a username and password that is an administrator there in the domain or has the appropriate credentials, and then complete this process by rebooting the computer and having it come back online. This process gets us through to the conclusion of all that bootstrapping that's necessary to bring this computer into full production. We will then, from our Windows 10 machine, now be able to complete the rest of the activities, like dealing with the installation of roles and features there inside our Windows 10 machine, either through PowerShell or the other management consoles we're used to working with. I should mention too that if you don't want to have to write all these commands down, I've actually included all these commands and the extra content associated with this course. So you'll be able to download that extra content and then get access to all the commands that we've been working with here.